We'll continue our discussion on managing user and group accounts by talking about configuring user defaults and login classes. Now, the default settings for user accounts are located in the system. However, we can change those by editing the adduser.conf file. Now, this file is not automatically created until you run the adduser-C command, and that command creates the adduser.conf and changes all the default settings for the user accounts that are created after that. We'll look at doing that in just a moment when we do the demonstration. Now, login classes, on the other hand, are managed by the login.conf file, and basically what they give you is the ability to create different logon classes for different groups of user accounts. You can create different settings for each individual group of users if you like, and then assign users to those classes. You could have different password requirements, you could have different expiration requirements, and so forth, and assign those to different users. So we'll look at managing login classes as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at doing the adduser-C and managing login classes. Okay, we're in our FreeBSD VMware box, and what we'd like to do first, we're logged in as root. We'd like to use the adduser command, and this time, instead of adding a user like we were doing before, we want to use a capital C. And with that, we're going to configure the adduser.conf file. So we have now prompts coming up for us, and we can leave those at the defaults or change them. For example, we can specify different UID, such as 2000. And we know that our BSD box so far has been assigning default UID starting with 1500 for users. We can specify a default login group if we like. We can enter additional groups if we like. These groups should already be created by editing the /etc/group file that we saw in an earlier session. We can change login classes if we have a different login class specified in the login.conf file, which we'll look at in just a moment. We can also specify which shell new users get. Now, normally they get the Bourne shell, which is SH for normal users, and root gets the C shell. We can specify that all users after this get the bash shell if we like. We can also specify that they get a different home directory. We're going to leave the home directory as it is for now, and we can change permissions to the home directory, but that's probably better to leave it as it is. And we want every user to definitely use password-based authentication. At minimum, we may also want them to use other forms of authentication, but at least a minimum of passwords. Do we want any of them to use empty passwords? Well, no. We don't want that. Do we want to generate random passwords for all users? No, we don't want to do that either. We want to assign them. If we're creating accounts for services for daemons, we might want to generate a random password. Now, do we want to lock the account out after creation? There might be instances where you would want to do that, but you probably want to do that on a per user basis and not as a default. So we're going to say no. And now we've got our defaults here that we've set up. We've changed the system defaults, and we're going to say yes to these and hit enter. And we don't need to re-edit it anymore, so we're going to say no. And now we're going to take a look at the /etc/adduser.conf, and it's going to get us the changes that were made to the defaults. So for the most part, most of the defaults were not changed, but we do require passwords now. We do have a default shell that we've added, and we could have changed other things, but we also changed the UID start with 2000. So the next user we create with the adduser command is going to get these defaults as well as the other defaults that we didn't change. If we didn't change it, it's going to stick with what the system defaults were to begin with. The next thing we want to do is take a look at the login.conf file. Now, this is in /etc, and that's the directory we're currently in. So what I'd like to do is cat /etc/login.conf. Let's see what it looks like. Let's go ahead and pipe that to less. And as you can see, the login.conf basically builds different profiles, and you can create different login profiles or login classes as it's called by editing this file. There's a lot of different instructions here that tells you kind of what you need to do. Also, it reminds you at the top there to rebuild the database after each change to this file. So let's go ahead and take a look. And what you've got is the defaults here, and that's the default login class. Now what you would do is you would copy this entire piece of text that we see on the screen and put it right under the default, and then you would name that to a new login class, and that way you have more than one. But you don't want to change the default, because at minimum you want people to use the default at least, and then change them to a different login class if it's required, if they need it. Now, as you can see, there's some different things you can change with the login classes, the environments and so forth, the message of the day, and things like that. So there's some different things you can change with the login classes. You can add them, you can change things, settings within them as well. Some other things you can change other than the message of the day are the path. You can change memory use, number of open files, and unmask. Now normally you may not want to change any of these settings. You may want to leave them as they are, and that's okay. You may only want certain users to inherit these login class settings, but you would create a new login class and then specify that when you create the user. Now one of the things you need to do when you finish editing this, when you add a class or edit the default class if you like, you need to run this command, the cap _ make db and then /etc/login.conf. This basically saves your changes to this file and reloads it so that you have new login classes. So that's basically a short discussion of how to change user defaults with the adduser-c command, which creates and changes the adduser.conf file. And we've also looked at the login.conf file, which changes and adds user login classes, which you can specify when you create a user.